A recent Liberal failure, which has gone largely underreported in the mainstream Canadian media, has cost Atlantic Canadians their jobs and has resulted in an Ethics Commissioner investigation. And what does this have to do with? Something called the Arctic surf clam. Why should you care about this? This is a decision that has had so many twists and turns that you're going to wonder whether or not this is a government decision process or an episode of a soap opera, but I digress. The Arctic surf clam is something that is very popular in Asian cuisines. Canada has come onto the world stage as a very viable industry to produce this particular good. You'll find it on little pieces of sushi, and this has been for several decades since a Canadian company invested heavily in proprietary technology to harvest this particular product as well as to process it, and this investment decision has resulted in many jobs, particularly in a community called Grand Bank in Atlantic Canada. Now, this type of an industry does rely on the government in terms of getting permits to harvest this type of resource, and in Canada, as in many countries around the world, we do have quotas and permitting processes to make sure that our fisheries industries are sustainably developed. So this year, in September of 2017, last year actually, Justin Trudeau's then Fisheries Minister, Dominic LeBlanc, announced that of all of the quota or the permits that the government issues for this particular industry, they were going to take 25% of that from existing proponents, set it aside, and do a call for proposals to have another player enter the marketplace. And the reason that they put this they said to the Canadian public why they were doing this was ostensibly to bring First Nations communities who are in the area more actively into the industry. So many bids were received. The process, the call for proposals closed in November, and it's my understanding that some of the existing players, they actually went out and tried to partner with First Nations communities to bring participants in. But in February of 2018, Minister LeBlanc, one of Justin Trudeau's top senior ministers, came out and announced that something called the Five Nations Clam Company would be the successful recipient of the bid. So here's the problem, and you're going to please remember that one of the main criteria and reasons that the government had listed for making this decision to carve off that 25% quota was First Nations participation. It was found out that out of all the bids that were submitted, the First Nations Clam Company had the least amount of First Nations participation, to the point where, and this is from subsequent court documents, the minister actually had to handwrite a note to his department officials saying that they needed to find more First Nations participation in their bid. So he knew, in writing this, he knew that the First Nations participation was low. It also came out that the Five Nations Clam Company didn't actually incorporate until after the bid was successfully awarded to them. It also came out that this entity did not have a boat. It had ostensibly or quasi-contracted with an American fishing boat that, anyway, you'd think that you'd need a boat for this type of an operation, so they don't have the high degree of First Nations participation, hadn't incorporated, didn't have a boat, and then something else came out. Two of the senior people who were involved in the Five Nations entity were, and these were senior people, were the first cousin of Dominic LeBlanc, the minister's wife, and the other was the brother of a sitting Liberal member of Parliament. So court case challenges were filed on this decision. My colleague Todd Doherty raised this issue in the House of Commons relentlessly. This just has not been this has not been followed in the Canadian media at all. But I want you to watch him hold the government to account.
For Caribou, Prince George.
Mr. Speaker, responding to questions about the Fisheries Minister's surf clam decision, the minister's most senior official confirmed that the Liberal-connected Five Nations had the lowest participation, First Nations participation out of all the applicants. She also confirmed that she had no knowledge of the minister's family connection to the unincorporated entity. She confirmed multiple times that this was the minister's sole personal decision. When did the minister become aware of the minister's family connections, and when did he know that Five Nations had the least amount of Indigenous participation?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our decision to introduce Indigenous participation is consistent with our commitment to developing a renewed relationship between Canada and Indigenous peoples. Enhancing access to the Arctic surf clam fishery broadens the distribution of benefits from this public resource and is a powerful step toward reconciliation. When the Conservatives went through a similar process to increase access to this fishery, they chose to exclude Indigenous peoples. And of course, the member will continue to work with the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner and follow his advice.
So you can imagine after weeks of these types of answers, Todd was not satisfied, and he actually filed a request for the Federal Ethics Commissioner to look at this particular decision. Then, of course, the Federal Ethics Commissioner did say that they would do that, and that I believe that that investigation is still ongoing. But the thing is that Todd, I have to give him a lot of credit. He's a British Columbia member of Parliament. Not a single one of the Liberal MPs in the area, none of them, not a single Liberal MP questioned this decision. And it took a Conservative opposition shadow critic to make any sort of headway on this issue. And headway he did, because last week, on the middle of a Friday afternoon, in the middle of the summer in Canada, the Liberals quietly released a news article stating that the decision to award this quota would be cancelled. That's very interesting, to the point where one, I believe he's affiliated with the CBC reporter, tweeted out in response to Deputy Leader of the Conservative Party, Lisa Ray's comment, saying, hey, interesting that it came out on a Friday afternoon in the middle of the summer. This reporter actually said something to the effect of taking out the trash day, referring to a practice of dumping news like this out on a day when it's not likely to get a lot of coverage. Now, certainly I think that this is something that is worthy of coverage, because the quota, that quota that I talked about, that 25%, it's kind of like, think about a farmer's field being planted for the year and then them not harvesting a quarter of the field. That's essentially what's happening in this industry this year, because the 2018 harvest year is basically what's being impacted. And that means that people are losing their jobs, there's a lot of uncertainty, and we're hearing from the fisheries industry themselves that this is leading to a loss of confidence in the investment climate in the fisheries community in Canada, because of course you don't want to put major investments in an industry where the government has shown itself to make these sort of knee-jerk reactions, because that lack of stability means a lack of the ability to plan for your business, and that means, of course, in turn, a loss of jobs. Now, in all of this, I think what is also really important to note is that the government, used the guise essentially of reconciliation with First Nations communities for the rationale of this bidding process. And for the minister to have written a handwritten note talking about the fact that one of the proponents that he was selecting didn't have a high degree of participation is a problem in that regard too, because if you're going to make a decision like this with the policy outcome being First Nations participation, there should be First Nations participation. And I think that that's really disappointing. Now, Minister LeBlanc was shuffled out in the cabinet shuffle this summer. He is no longer the fisheries minister, but he now is the minister in charge of intergovernmental affairs. And today it was announced that he would be leading the task force on the illegal border crossing crisis with provincial governments. So the guy who oversaw this decision is now going to be in charge of the process to deal with the provinces on the fact that the federal government is trying to create a permanent program to house people who illegally cross the border from safe spaces like upstate New York, claim asylum in Canada, in hotels in the Greater Toronto area. That's Liberal governance for you. It's crazy. Anyway, this is very serious. My colleague Todd Doherty, again, if you want to watch more on this particular issue, he's got a lot of videos on his channel. You can find them there. This is a really important issue just to show something smells fishy. I couldn't resist. But in all seriousness, this has cost a lot of Atlantic Canadians their jobs, and the Liberals should be held to account, even by their own members. Todd, you're doing a great job. Working hard for you. Please share this video. Please put your comments in the comment section, like this video. Have a great day.